Some people don't destroy your peace with anger or violence. They do it with soft words and quiet expectations. They ask for your time, your energy, your patience, again and again. Until one day you look in the mirror and realize you've given up pieces of yourself just to keep them happy. Carl Jung once warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. In this video, you'll discover 5 subtle things people might ask from you. Not out of love, but out of fear, insecurity, or control. And if you keep saying yes, you'll lose the most important person in your life, yourself. Her name was Emily, and she was drowning in the shallow waters of everyone else's expectations. At 28, she had perfected the art of invisible suffering. She was the friend who always picked up the phone at midnight, the daughter who never missed a family obligation, the girlfriend who swallowed her words to keep the peace. Emily had become a master of saying, "I'm fine," while her soul was screaming for help. But here's what nobody tells you about people-pleasers. We don't start that way. We become that way. Drop by drop, compromise by compromise, until one day we look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. Emily's apartment was filled with thank you cards from people she'd helped, but her heart felt like an empty room. She would lie in bed at night, exhausted from carrying everyone else's emotions, wondering why kindness felt so much like self-destruction. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was surrounded by people who claimed to love her, yet she had never felt more alone. Carl Jung once wrote something that would later haunt Emily's thoughts. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. She discovered this quote on a particularly difficult Tuesday morning, scrolling through her phone while her coffee grew cold. Her boyfriend had just left after another argument that wasn't really an argument, just him expressing frustration while she absorbed it like a sponge. Emily thought she was being kind. She thought she was being mature. But slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Every time she said yes to someone else's needs, she was unconsciously saying no to her own. Every time she prioritized someone else's comfort, she was teaching them that her discomfort didn't matter. And the most painful part? No one seemed to notice. Her sacrifices had become so routine, so expected, that they were invisible to everyone except the person making them. Jung's words felt like a key turning in a lock she didn't even know existed. What if her endless giving wasn't kindness at all? What if it was fear dressed up as virtue? The first warning sign came disguised as love. It was a Friday evening when her boyfriend Marcus walked through the door with that familiar expression, the one that meant Emily's night was about to be redesigned around his mood. "I've had the worst day," he said, not even asking about hers. "Can you just not be emotional right now? I need you to make me feel better." Emily felt something crack inside her chest. She had actually been looking forward to sharing news about a promotion opportunity at work. Instead, she found herself nodding, pushing down her excitement, molding herself into whatever shape would soothe his frustration. She made his favorite dinner. She listened to his complaints. She offered solutions he didn't want and comfort he barely acknowledged. By the end of the evening, she felt like she had disappeared entirely. Later, as Marcus scrolled through his phone beside her in bed, Emily stared at the ceiling and realized something terrifying. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked how to make her happy. Worse, she couldn't remember the last time she had asked herself that question. Carl Jung warned us about this very thing. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Marcus was avoiding his pain by making it Emily's responsibility to fix. And Emily was avoiding her own pain by accepting that role. The second red flag appeared wrapped in the language of love. Emily had been dreaming about a solo trip to Colorado for months. She'd been working overtime, saving money, researching hiking trails. The idea of spending a week in solitude, reconnecting with herself, felt like water to someone dying of thirst. When she finally mentioned it to Marcus over breakfast, his fork froze halfway to his mouth. "Why do you need that?" he asked, and Emily heard the edge in his voice. "You're not the type for solo adventures. Besides, I love you just as you are. Please don't change." Those last 4 words landed like stones in Emily's stomach. Please don't change. What he meant was, please don't grow. Please don't discover parts of yourself that don't revolve around me. Please stay small enough to fit into my comfort zone. Emily found herself nodding, canceling her plans, folding her dreams into smaller and smaller shapes until they disappeared entirely. She told herself this was love. This was compromise. This was what good girlfriends did. But late that night, she found herself Googling, "Why do I feel trapped in my own life?" And the search results felt like mirrors reflecting back a truth she wasn't ready to face. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how could she become who she was meant to be if the people around her were terrified of that transformation? The third pattern emerged during a family dinner that felt more like a performance than a gathering. Emily's mother, Patricia, had always been the kind of woman who mistook control for love. As the eldest daughter, Emily had learned early that peace came at the price of her own voice. "Don't argue with me," Patricia said when Emily gently suggested a different approach to her mother's ongoing conflict with a neighbor. "Good daughters listen. They don't question." Emily felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the physical sensation of swallowing words that needed to be spoken. She nodded, smiled, and agreed, even though every cell in her body was screaming in protest. This had been their dance for 28 years. Patricia would express an opinion, often harsh or unfair, and Emily would either agree or say nothing. Disagreement was labeled as disrespect. Independent thought was seen as rebellion. That night, Emily found herself journaling for the first time in years. When did my truth become so threatening to everyone around me? When did my thoughts become something to be managed rather than heard? Carl Jung had written, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Emily was beginning to understand that her mother's need for constant agreement wasn't about respect. It was about avoiding the discomfort of being challenged, even gently. The fourth warning sign came from her best friend, Sarah, during what Emily thought was going to be a normal coffee date. Sarah was in the middle of another dramatic relationship crisis, and Emily found herself in the familiar role of unpaid therapist. But this time, when Emily offered honest, gentle feedback about some patterns she was seeing, Sarah's expression shifted. "You get me, right?" Sarah said, her voice carrying a subtle threat. "I'm not overreacting. You always understand my side." Emily recognized the trap immediately. Sarah wasn't looking for wisdom or perspective. She was looking for validation, for someone to confirm that her reality was the only reality that mattered. When Emily had tried to offer different viewpoints in the past, Sarah would become distant, passive-aggressive, or would simply stop sharing altogether. So Emily had learned to edit her honesty, to offer comfort instead of truth. "Of course," Emily heard herself saying, "you're absolutely right." But as she spoke the words, she felt something die inside her chest. How many friendships in her life were built on this foundation of selective honesty? How many people loved her not for who she was, but for her willingness to echo back their own thoughts? That evening, Emily wrote in her journal, "I have become a mirror for everyone else's ego. But who am I when no one is looking?" The fifth and final pattern revealed itself on what was supposed to be Emily's first free weekend in 3 months. She had planned nothing elaborate, just rest, a book she'd been trying to read for weeks, maybe a long bath. The idea of time that belonged entirely to her felt revolutionary. But at 7 a.m. on Saturday, her phone rang. Her sister Lisa's voice was frantic, exhausted. I'm drowning here. Can you watch the kids this weekend? I desperately need a break, and you're so good with them." Emily looked at her unmade bed, at the book waiting on her nightstand, at the bath salts she'd bought herself as a small act of self-care. She felt the familiar weight settling on her shoulders, the weight of everyone else's urgent needs pressing down on her own quiet desires. "Of course," she said, because that's what she always said. By Sunday evening, Emily was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. She sat on Lisa's couch, watching the sunset through someone else's window, surrounded by someone else's mess, and felt like a stranger in her own life. That's when the question that would change everything finally surfaced. When did my time stop belonging to me? It wasn't anger she felt, it was grief. Grief for all the moments she had given away without being asked. for all the times she had prioritized everyone else's rest while running herself into the ground. That night, Emily stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 2 a.m. and for the first time in years, really looked at herself. The person staring back was tired in a way that makeup couldn't hide. Her eyes held a sadness that seemed to go all the way down to her bones. She looked like someone who had been holding her breath for so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. "Why do I keep giving so much?" she whispered to her reflection. "And still feel so empty?" The answer came not as words, but as a feeling, a recognition that she had been living her life as an apology for taking up space. She had been so afraid of being seen as selfish that she had made herself invisible. Carl Jung's words echoed in the silence of her bathroom. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. Emily realized she had been looking outside for so long, at other people's needs, other people's opinions, other people's definitions of who she should be, that she had forgotten to look inside. She had forgotten that she even existed as a separate person with her own dreams, her own needs, her own right to take up space in the world. That night, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She was going to start paying attention to the voice inside her that she had been silencing for years. The awakening didn't happen overnight. It came in waves, each one bringing new awareness and new pain. Emily began to notice patterns that had been invisible to her before. The more she gave, the more people expected, not out of malice, but because she had trained them to see her as an inexhaustible resource. Her kindness had become their entitlement. When she said no for the first time in months, declining to work late on a project that wasn't her responsibility, her boss seemed genuinely shocked. When she told Marcus she needed an evening to herself, he accused her of being distant. When she didn't immediately respond to Sarah's dramatic texts, Sarah accused her of not caring. "If you train people to believe you don't have limits," Emily wrote in her journal, "they'll never respect your boundaries. They can't respect boundaries they've never seen." The hardest part wasn't other people's reactions. It was her own guilt. Every time she prioritized her own needs, a voice inside her head whispered that she was being selfish, that she was letting people down, that she was a bad friend, daughter, girlfriend. But Emily was beginning to understand something crucial. There's a difference between being kind and being available. There's a difference between being loving and being used. Jung had written, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Emily was starting to understand why it was so terrifying, because it meant disappointing people who had grown comfortable with her self-neglect. The moment that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon when Emily's mother called with a familiar request. "Your Aunt Helen is having people over this weekend," Patricia said, her tone already assuming Emily's compliance. "She specifically asked for you to come. You know how much family means to us." Emily felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the automatic yes forming on her lips. But this time, something different happened. This time, she paused. She thought about her weekend plans. Simple things like grocery shopping, laundry, maybe calling an old friend she'd been meaning to reconnect with. Small things that felt precious precisely because they were hers. "Not this time, Mom," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to rest this weekend." The silence on the other end of the line felt endless. Emily could practically hear her mother's shock, her disappointment, her confusion at this deviation from their established script. "I don't understand," Patricia finally said. "It's just one afternoon. Don't be selfish, Emily." There it was, the word that had controlled Emily's choices for years. Selfish. The ultimate accusation, the label that had kept her saying yes when every fiber of her being wanted to say no. But this time, Emily recognized it for what it was, manipulation disguised as morality. "I'm not being selfish, Mom," she said quietly. "I'm being honest about my limits." When she hung up the phone, Emily's hands were shaking. But underneath the fear, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. Not the freedom that comes from hurting someone else, but the freedom that comes from not abandoning yourself. Emily's healing didn't look like a dramatic movie montage. It looked like small, quiet choices made over and over again. She started journaling every morning, asking herself questions she had never thought to ask. What do I want today? What do I need? What would make me feel alive? She began saying maybe later instead of right now when people made requests of her time. She started taking solo walks without her phone, rediscovering the sound of her own thoughts without the constant input of other people's needs. When someone asked too much of her, she learned to ask herself a crucial question. Is this kindness, or is this self-betrayal? The distinction became clearer with practice. Kindness was choosing to help when she had the energy and resources to give. Self-betrayal was saying yes when she was already depleted, just to avoid someone else's disappointment. Carl Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart." Emily was finally learning to look inward instead of constantly scanning the horizon for other people's approval. She discovered that she actually liked being alone. She found out she had opinions about politics, art, and life that didn't match her family's expectations. She remembered dreams she had abandoned and slowly began to reclaim them. The Colorado trip she had canceled months earlier, she rebooked it. This time, when Marcus expressed his displeasure, she didn't cancel. She went anyway. Not everyone in Emily's life was happy with her transformation. Some people drifted away when they realized she was no longer available to be their emotional dumping ground or their constant source of validation. Marcus was one of them. When Emily stopped managing his moods and started expressing her own needs, their relationship revealed itself to be built on a foundation of inequality. He wanted a girlfriend who would make his life easier, not a partner who would challenge him to grow. The breakup was painful but necessary. Emily grieved not just the end of the relationship, but the years she had spent trying to earn love by making herself smaller. But other relationships deepened in beautiful ways. Her friendship with her college roommate Rachel flourished when Emily stopped being afraid to disagree with her. Her relationship with her younger brother improved when she started being honest about their family dynamics instead of pretending everything was fine. Even her relationship with her mother began to shift, slowly and sometimes painfully, as Emily learned to set boundaries with love rather than anger. The people who truly loved Emily, not just the convenient, accommodating version of her, stayed. They respected her boundaries because they respected her as a whole person, not just as a source of support. A year later, Emily looked different. Not physically, though there was a new lightness in her posture, a new clarity in her eyes. The difference was deeper than that. She had learned to distinguish between her voice and the voices of everyone who had ever told her who she should be. She had learned that saying no to others often meant saying yes to herself. Emily still helped people, but from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsive obligation. She still showed up for the people she loved, but she also showed up for herself. She discovered that true kindness required boundaries, that real love meant allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices rather than constantly rescuing them, that the most generous thing she could do was to model what it looked like to respect her own needs. On quiet evenings, Emily would sometimes think about the person she used to be, the woman who had disappeared so completely into other people's lives that she had forgotten her own existence. She felt compassion for that version of herself, understanding now that her people-pleasing had been a survival strategy, a way of trying to earn love and avoid abandonment. But she also felt grateful that she had found her way back to herself. If Emily could go back and tell her younger self anything, it would be this: your worth is not determined by your usefulness to others. Your value doesn't increase with your availability or decrease with your boundaries. The people who love you for who you are will respect your limits. The people who only love you for what you do for them will call you selfish when you start honoring your own needs. This is information, not indictment. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to say no without explaining yourself into exhaustion. Your kindness is a gift, not an obligation. When you give it freely from a place of choice rather than compulsion, it becomes more meaningful, not less. The relationships built on your self-sacrifice are not sustainable. They will either evolve to include your wholeness or they will end. Both outcomes are better than spending your life as a ghost of who you could have been. Emily never met Carl Jung, of course. He died decades before she was born. But his words had become a compass for her journey back to herself. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. She understood now that this privilege came with a price: the courage to disappoint people who had grown comfortable with your self-denial. the strength to stand alone sometimes, rather than disappear into someone else's vision of who you should be. Jung also wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Emily had made her unconscious patterns conscious. She had recognized the ways she had been giving away her power, disguising self-abandonment as virtue. And in doing so, she had reclaimed her life from what she had thought was fate but was actually choice. Through her journey, Emily identified the 5 requests that had slowly eroded her sense of self. These were the red flags she wished she had recognized earlier. 1. Make me happy. When someone makes you responsible for their emotional state while ignoring your own. 2. Please don't change. When someone loves you conditionally, only as long as you stay small enough for their comfort. 3. Always agree with me. When someone requires your silence or compliance to feel secure in the relationship. 4. Tell me I'm right. When someone uses your relationship as validation rather than genuine connection. 5. Put me first. When someone consistently prioritizes their needs over yours and expects you to do the same. These weren't always spoken directly. Sometimes they came disguised as love, as family loyalty, as being a good friend. But the result was always the same. Emily's erasure in service of someone else's comfort. Emily learned that real love, whether romantic, familial, or friendship, looked completely different from what she had been accepting. Real love encouraged her growth, even when it was inconvenient. Real love celebrated her boundaries rather than testing them. Real love meant being seen and accepted as a whole person, not just the parts that were useful or comfortable. She found this kind of love eventually, with friends who asked about her dreams as often as they shared their own problems. With a partner who wanted to know her thoughts, not just her agreement. With family members who learned to respect her no as clearly as they had always expected her yes. But the most important love she found was self-love. Not the kind that required mantras or affirmations, but the kind that showed up in her choices. The love that said, you matter, your needs matter, your voice matters. Emily's transformation had unexpected consequences. When she stopped being available for every crisis, some people were forced to develop their own coping skills. When she stopped agreeing with everything, conversations became more interesting and honest. When she started expressing her own needs, she gave other people permission to do the same. Her younger cousin, who had been watching Emily's people-pleasing patterns and starting to repeat them, began setting her own boundaries after seeing Emily's example. Her brother finally stood up to their mother's criticisms after watching Emily navigate those conversations with grace and firmness. Even Marcus, months after their breakup, sent her a text thanking her for forcing him to confront his own emotional immaturity. Emily realized that her healing wasn't just about her. It was about breaking generational patterns of self-abandonment and modeling what healthy relationships could look like. Emily's story didn't end with a perfect life free of all conflict. She still struggled sometimes with the urge to overgive, to apologize for taking up space, to make herself smaller to avoid disappointing others. But now she had tools. She had awareness. She had a practice of checking in with herself before automatically saying yes to others. She learned that healing wasn't a destination but a daily choice. The choice to honor her own experience as valid, to treat her own needs as worthy of attention, to love herself as fiercely as she had always loved others. Some days this felt natural. Other days it felt like swimming upstream. But Emily had learned that the alternative, disappearing into other people's lives, was no longer an option. She had tasted freedom, and there was no going back to the cage of constant compliance. This story isn't about becoming cold or selfish or uncaring. It's not about building walls or shutting people out. It's about the revolutionary act of including yourself in your own life. It's about understanding that you can be kind without being available. You can be loving without being used. You can be generous without being depleted. The people who ask you to make them happy, to never change, to always agree, to tell them they're right, to put them first, these people are not asking for love. They're asking for a version of you that doesn't fully exist. They're asking you to play a supporting role in your own life. Carl Jung reminded us, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he also warned us, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. It's terrifying because it means some people won't like the real you as much as they liked the accommodating version. It's terrifying because it means taking responsibility for your own happiness instead of outsourcing it to others' approval. But it's also the only path to a life that truly belongs to you. Emily learned that the most powerful yes she could ever give was the one she gave to herself. Yes to her dreams, even when others called them impractical. Yes to her boundaries, even when others called them selfish. Yes to her truth, even when others preferred her silence. This wasn't the end of Emily's story. It was the beginning of a life lived from the inside out, rather than the outside in. The beginning of relationships based on truth rather than performance. The beginning of a love so complete that it had room for her whole, authentic, beautifully imperfect self. And sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet, Emily would remember the woman she used to be. The one who gave everything and felt empty, who said yes to everyone except herself. And she would whisper a promise into the darkness. Never again. Because the privilege of a lifetime really is becoming who you truly are. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be anyone else. Jung's final words echoed in Emily's heart. Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. Emily had awakened. And in doing so, she had given herself the greatest gift of all. The permission to exist as herself, fully and unapologetically, in a world that would always prefer her accommodation. The end was actually the beginning.